Wild Health is about optimizing you. We use genomics, blood work, biometrics, microbiome assessment, many other tests, and a conversation with you to come up with a full health optimization plan. What's the perfect diet, exercise, and supplement plan for you and only you? The Wild Health Podcast is about optimizing all of us. Here we cover the cutting-edge science that gives you the base to be able to apply the personalized plan we give you as a patient. To sign up as a patient, go to wildhealth.com. Or if you're a physician or health coach and you want to learn how to do this for your patients, we're happy to help as well. Wildhealth.com for all the information on becoming a patient or working with us.
What's up, all you wildly healthy people out there? This is Ben Askins hosting the podcast today. Psychiatric physician assistant, master of divinity, all around good dude. I'm joined as a co-host today with my friend, Dr. Tom McCoy, Wild Health's medical director and lead physician of Athletic Optimization Division. He's a CrossFitter, he's a doctor, he's a lover and a fighter. He's a real life comic book superhero. He's fantastic. And we're super pumped to have as a guest on the podcast today, Frye, licensed clinical social worker. He is a brain spotting psychotherapist with a passion for supporting individuals, particularly athletes with performance issues, the yips, and anxiety about performance. He's worked in hospice for over 20 years as well, addressing grief and anxiety with folks at the end of life and their families. But he's also been in private practice for about 6 or 7 years, had the good fortune to study under the man who wrote the book on what's called brain spotting, Dr. David Grand. And we're going to spend some time picking Thad's brain about the subject of brain spotting.
And while we're on that topic, I think as good a place to start as any, Thad, would be for you just to define for us what brain spotting actually is. Because for a lot of folks, this is probably a new term that they haven't heard before. So just kind of ground us and set us on our journey here today.
Awesome. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for having me, and it's going to be hard to live up to two guys like you. I heard those intros; those are pretty impressive. So I think brain spotting will become even more clear as we talk through it through today. So I'm excited to be able to share that with you. But brain spotting is basically a psychological and somatic modality that allows people to work with their felt sense in their body, as well as a fixed eye position, to be able to access their limbic brain, where we often feel connections to our trauma history and or connections to that fight, flight, or freeze response that influences us in many ways that we don't even realize it's influencing us. And it helps us to process that through to get us back to baseline. And so it works in many different ways, but that's the basic gist of it.
Oh, that's really exciting. I mean, I can see just right off the bat how that could be very applicable for a lot of our athletes, both weekend warriors and professionals. So I'm excited to talk more about that later on. Can you give us a little bit of background just of the origin story of brain spotting, how it came about and its development?
Yeah, that'd be great. So it was developed by Dr. David Grand out of New York. He actually was a psychoanalyst and an EMDR therapist. He was also a trainer. So he was knee deep in the EMDR world. And he noticed that sometimes in doing an EMDR, they'll use the bilateral stimulation by having the client follow the eye or the fingers, of going back and forth so that somebody can have that bilateral stimulation. And he noticed that some clients that was too stimulating, so he actually slowed it down And so he wrote a book about that. He was trying that out. And he actually, that's why it's great to be talking about athletes here, is that he actually was working with a skater, and he'd been working with her for over a year, 90-minute sessions once a week, and done some really good work with her. But she noticed that when she was trying to do this thing called a triple loop, she would usually get about 2 into it, and then she would just bail out. She wouldn't be able to complete the thing. In practice, she often could, but then in competition, she wouldn't be able to. So we now can look at it as maybe a form of the yips. But at the time, it was just like, why is this happening? And so he noticed when he was working with her and using, again, that finger to go back and forth, he said that he was going across her field of vision and felt like he saw her eyes wobble, and it felt like something just grabbed his hand to stay in that one position, which we now call a fixed eye position, right? And she noticed that she was able to process for the next 20 minutes and touch on subjects she hadn't before, felt a lot of relief at the end. And she called him the next day and said she was able to do the triple loop. So that's kind of the origin story. So he thought that was interesting. He also, he was a therapist for other therapists, and he would show them what he'd learned, and they would take that to their clients. And it kind of naturally just grew out of that, especially for the first 10 years or so. It was really organic, and then turned into trainings, and then went on from there.
Yeah, so it's a pretty exciting, pretty recent development then, it sounds like. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it was a good question. It was developed in 2003, I believe. So we're just at about 20 years.
Yeah, a lot of our patients are both physicians themselves and athletes, and it's hard to make decisions around. We want to stay on the cutting edge of what's out there to provide for our patients, and then still be as evidence-based as possible. Are there any, ancient practices that show any kind of similarity to this, or any kind of history before Dr. Grand that you could see connecting dots to in any way?
I like that, connecting dots. That sounds like a brain spot metaphor at some level. But there are definitely some. If you look back, one of the ones that I've noticed in doing my own meditation practice is I think it's called Troctica, which is, they'll often call it a middle gaze allowance for, in meditation, just looking straight ahead. They'll call it candle gazing, where you allow yourself just to hold that eye position and notice, come back to the breath. What is, and there's many other traditions where we have something called dual attunement, where we are both with the client, and in therapy terms, that would be kind of the Rogerian, Carl Rogers version of just having open-ended regard for your client, curiosity, not saying I know more than you and I'm going to tell you what's up, but just kind of allowing yourself just to be wide open. And we're also connected to the neurobiology, by looking at the eyes, by noticing when people are having reflexes. That's what helps us know when to stop to find those things. So there are past connections in other cultures where people are noting these things of other people. But David's the one that took EMDR and something called somatic experiencing, which was started by Dr. Peter Levine, which is noticing what's going on in the body, going into the body, so that any freeze from fight, flight, or freeze response can be worked through the body. And you often see people shake and have movements as they kind of wake up from those experiences and allow themselves to process through.
Yeah, a lot of dots to connect there between, vision and unconditional positive regard and waking the tiger. All of that stuff is
yes.
pretty cutting edge, and pretty cutting edge of like 10,000 years ago at the same time somehow, right?
Yes, for sure. And nice callback. Yep.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, in the athletics sphere, in the world of high performance, I mean, yips almost take on a taboo type aspect, in that, we don't want to talk about them. And if you see somebody get them, you almost want to create distance because we're afraid they're contagious. And
Absolutely.
so I'm just curious how, as a practitioner, you approach this with your athletes and begin the discussion, is kind of part one of that
Yeah.
question. And part two is, how do you think about this almost as a preemptive strategy at keeping pathways open and flowing well? And do you ever worry about uncovering subconscious issues by doing this work that weren't an issue previously?
Yeah. There's a lot of good questions. You might have to review them with me, but I'll start with that idea of you said it. I've heard people talk about yips being contagious, right? So as you said, I want to be away from that. I don't want to see that. I might take that on in my own neurobiology. So it's a great question. I normalize it a lot to say that it happens in small ways throughout people's lives. And so obviously we see it in athletes that are in the NFL, NHL, all those things. But people actually have those. I've worked with surgeons that have had a form of the yips. I've worked with people in other fields that will also, all of a sudden, it feels like it comes out of nowhere. But the beauty in it, like you said, I guess the second question is that it can be very preemptive because we talk about the yips seeming like they come out of nowhere, but really they've been around. The roots of the tree that's falling has been, letting go of that ground for a long time. So often it is some connection to, in the sports world, what I do before after I do my initial meeting with an athlete is I ask them about any sports related traumas, any sports related embarrassments,
Mm-hmm.
what their relationship with coaches, family members, what those things were like. Also, injuries and watching other people get injured in their sport. So that vicarious trauma that occurs, and we write it out. And I don't care if they were 5 years old and the ball went through their legs and they lost their game for their guys, and then they look around and people are angry at them and they think, man, that happened forever ago. If they're noticing activation around that, then we work with brain spotting to help them go back to that time, notice what they're feeling, and process it through. So what we want to do is allow people, whether they have the yips, I work with my, in my website, I talk about them. So often people actually reach out to me specifically by that point. So that's how that often happens. And again, I normalize it and I walk them through what we're going to do. But like you said, I also work with people with high performance, and it's nice to be able to go back and work through some of those past sports related traumas as well, so they don't later have the yips be created.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you describe it that way because I know, I, like many folks, will try to get out on the golf course when I can and struggle like everybody else. But when you see someone struggle or develop a yip, I mean, that, and correct me if my terminology is incorrect here, but that you could see that as almost a micro trauma.
Yes.
That it could be beneficial for even being around somebody who's experiencing that, to go through this process and work with that as much as the person who's actually experiencing it.
Perfect. I just like we were talking about by that vicarious trauma. I think of oftentimes skiers being up on top of the mountain and watching the person before them, who's their competition, right? They want to do better than that person that's going down the course. But when that person wipes out and really hurts themselves, we feel that. So you're right. It can be micro, but it's still, we feel it, especially if it's somebody we know and we're watching them hit the ball and it's one of those putts and that should be easy to make. It's usually those things that should be easy that become the most difficult to watch. So yes, definitely that can be the kind of the contagious part of it.
Yeah, you can get caught into one of those yip loops, which seems to be just engaged with some of the memories that you're talking about collecting an inventory of. You get that memory inventory and just walk through even 5-year-old me pulling a Bill Buckner and letting the ball go behind the bag. And then, how does that affect me right now? My brain doesn't know the difference between time and space. So you kind of try to unwind some of those things, essentially, put the memories
Yes.
on the shelf where they belong so you can make some new not yippy ones. Is that pretty? Am I tracking with you so far pretty well? Is there?
Yes, you're totally tracking, and non-yippy is a great way of saying it. We don't want to create these things, right? And so when, as you talked about, the mid part of our brain is timeless, and so we feel like we're still engaged in that often. So if we can help somebody clear that out of their nervous system so that they don't have to recreate that, that's what we want to do. So that's why it's good to get ahead of this often. But if they don't come in until they are having those problems, we can definitely work with them at that point too.
Is there a way
are there
then?
ways that we as individuals are there way that we as individuals can tap into this technique almost on our own? Obviously, not all of us are going to have the ability or the resources to reach out, financial or otherwise, to professionals occasionally. Are there things that we can do when we experience these types of traumas on our own to help process them?
Yeah, I'm always a little cautious just because, especially if we were talking about traumas outside of the sports world, and I don't want to take away from the sports related traumas because those are very real as well. So I would always say if you can even afford 1 or 2 sessions with a brain spotting therapist or a brain spotting coach to at least see what that feels like, kind of get to understand it more, to know if you're doing it right, all of those things, that's great. But basically, one of the quotes from brain spotting is where you look affects how you feel. And so if I notice that in my pitching lately, all of a sudden, all we need to have is something that changes minutely, that all of a sudden I'm doing some kind of muscle guarding reflex, and all of a sudden I'm throwing into the ground. And so now I'm getting so nervous ahead of time before the game even starts that I'm saying I'm going to do it. It's going to happen, right? So we get in those mindsets. So again, what I would have somebody do is notice that feeling in their body, notice where it's happening. So I'm making it up. I feel it at 9 out of 10 in my chest, meaning 0, I'm not feeling it at all. 10, I'm feeling it. It's way too much. Then I allow myself to look around the room, quite literally, just go across my field of vision. And I usually start on one side and slowly work across and notice, just see if where your eyes land, if that feeling goes up, if it goes down, if it stays the same. If I'm working with activation to try to work that through their system, then I'm usually working with activation. So where do you feel that more as you're scanning the room? If I'm working to help them be more resourced in their body, we can still process from that. But then instead of it being a 9 out of 10, maybe for whatever reason, as I'm looking here in the center of the room, I feel like I can breathe a little bit. I feel like, okay, there's something that I can identify in my body that's shifting just because of where I'm looking. And that allows us to start processing through. So they call it self-brain spotting. And again, I would, perfect world, love to have somebody work with somebody just for enough to feel comfortable with it. But I utilize it with my athletes all the time, especially in working on things. Once we've cleared a lot of that stuff from their limbic brain, then we work on what's called like being in the zone and connecting to like when I kick butt, I feel this way in my body, so that they can actually have people, sitting at the free throw line, and maybe they know they have an eye position up and to their left. So they look at it for like 2 or 3 seconds, notice that feeling of like, I got this. I feel solid in my feet. I know what this feels like. And then they shoot, right? So people are doing this all the time without us noticing it as fans.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think that a lot of these performance issues are processes that we're taking ourselves out of the moment, right? And
Yes.
it becomes almost this self-fulfilling prophecy where we're seeing ourselves as failing after we've had that experience, and that's setting us up from a limbic standpoint to fulfill that prophecy.
Yep.
And so by utilizing this technique, it really becomes a mindfulness practice to bring you back to the moment and put yourself in the mindset to where you really do feel like you can perform your best. Is that accurate?
You got it right. I mean, that speaks beautifully to, again, processing that old material that is keeping us in a fight, flight, or freeze response. So a survival, think about it from that standpoint. And so if we work through a lot of that, then we're getting back to baseline. So then we can allow ourselves, as you said so beautifully, to be in the moment, to do what you already know how to do so well, that you've trained all your life to be able to do. So it doesn't give you superhuman powers, but it allows you to get back to who you are. And we can do expansion, so we can work on, again, when you're in that flow state, what does that feel like? And we can work from there too. But I always want to work at clearing out that fight, flight, or freeze response first before we try to add on anything differently.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about why this technique could be particularly advantageous with the athletic population, in that a lot of us sometimes will struggle with the top-down approach from a cognitive aspect, and this is really kind of trying to tie physical or emotional feelings and how
Yes.
that may be easier to tap into for some people?
I love that question. So it goes into a theme I often talk to with people, is that when I was doing talk therapy, and maybe I had a really good connection with that client, and we were able to work on visualizing and breathing techniques, and normalizing and looking at what's going on in the brain, people would eventually often say, I totally hear what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense to me, but I don't feel differently. And that's where that's what keyed me into, as I was starting my brain spotting journey, that, oh, this might work very well. And David and Paige Roberts and some other people teach on this. So, but it was wonderful to be able to have them work with that mid part of their brain. And what I tell people is, the beauty in this is you don't have to have the vocabulary for it. We actually often don't want you to be in that, because then we're using that left upper hemisphere of our brain, and we're not allowing ourselves just to be with the feelings, the emotions, the somatic responses. So what I like about it is that we can go into it, just allow for whatever is there, and then we can kind of open it up from there. So that, like you said, that bottom up processing, if they can, sometimes we find out what the original trauma was, or what the event that occurred. Sometimes, as I tell people, we're never going to find out. We're going to have that aha moment. But if you feel better in your body and you're able to get back to baseline plus, then it doesn't really matter that we understand fully how we arrived there.
Yeah, it's a results oriented game ultimately, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I love this approach, right? Because it's, oftentimes as practitioners, whatever it is, we're providing, we try to square peg, round hole folks a lot, right? And so having approaches both from a top down or a bottom up strategy where you can really bring the modality that's going to work best for the person, I think is really powerful, right?
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Can you talk a little bit about kind of your background and training? Because obviously this being a bit of a newer technique and relatively, young in its life, where did you learn about it? What kind of training did you have to do to become a practitioner? What does that look like?
Sure. Great question. So let's see, I think I got trained about 7 years ago, and then I dove in headlong. I actually had worked for hospice for many years, and had a private practice on the side. And I was asking a friend who was a therapist, who had actually a major loss in the family system. And I asked her, I'm here in Boulder, Colorado. There's a lot of therapists and a lot of modalities out here. And I said, what should I get trained in? And she said, there's this thing called brain spotting that helped me after this big loss so much more than anything else that I tried. And I thought, that's an interesting name. There wasn't a lot of information out there. There's a lot more now. I didn't even look into it too much. So anyway, I did what we call phase 1 training here in Boulder with now a friend of mine, but Dr. Frye, and learned about it. we often use, with that fixed eye position, we often use a pointer. And I remember thinking, why the heck are we in psychology using a stick? It made no sense to me. It wasn't my background at all. So there was some disbelief. I love sharing this story. The first time we learned about it, we got to watch Pi be with a client and walk her through her trauma response. And then we broke off in pairs in this large room, a bunch of us all in the room, and we were practicing on each other. So we were the therapist and the client. And I remember this very lovely lady who was the therapist, and she was doing it, and I was the client, and I was working on a loss that I had. And I heard all these people around me crying and emoting and having these experiences, and I didn't, and not for the first minute or two. And I even thought maybe I should just make it up and say, I didn't want to ruin her experience. And so, but I decided, no, just allow yourself to be with the feeling and go into it, and don't try to think your way through this. That's the opposite of what we're supposed to do. And I allowed myself to process through a big loss that I had. So I say that to say that it was a beautiful part of my beginning of my journey. I dove headlong into it, took phase 1, phase 2. Phase 3 is where we work with athletes, performers, musicians. Phase 4, a lot of specialty classes. Now I assist a lot of trainings. I became a consultant so that I get to help others who want to become certified in brain spotting. So I get to teach, which I love. So it really became a huge part of my practice. And there's a lot of specializations now. So working with kids, working with the body, working with couples, all sorts of good stuff.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you know, and again, it being relatively young in its trajectory, the research may not be there yet, but do you know, have there been any sort of kind of functional real-time imaging studies looking at parts of the brain that are activated while you're doing this, and if that correlates with the pathways that we think are playing a part?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And that is definitely not my emphasis, just in being a practitioner and not a researcher. But I can say that we're kind of in that place, being 20 years in just now, kind of where EMDR was in their process of doing a lot more research. So I can tell you that I know of 7 studies that are being done just off the top of my head. But as far as the images that are used, we often look at, because EMDR and brain spotting are similar in the areas of the brain that they're affected, that we tend to look at those. But there are people that are definitely doing that. We make a joke to say that if anybody has the money to be able to talk to Dr. Amen about doing some imaging studies, we'd like to have those opportunities. So
that always seems to be the rate limiting step, even with the best ideas, is
yes,
to find somebody with the resources to invest in the research to validate things that we know are working well for folks, right?
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, another kind of obviously hot area of research in mental health in general is the use of plant-based medicines and other molecules to kind of augment the therapeutic approach. Do you know, is that something that's been incorporated at all in the brain spotting technique, or something that folks are experimenting with?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that too. It definitely is. There's a Facebook page that I just saw the other day, but it's been around for a good long time, that is around brain spotting and psychedelics. I just finished up a 10-month course in psychedelics and psychotherapy. And so I've already been utilizing it, brain spotting, with intention setting a lot. And then as people are trying to integrate it into their lives. So integration, I think it works beautifully because it's another non-ordinary state. And so people often, one of my clients that sticks out in my head is that she worked with ketamine, and she noticed during her processing, being with medicine, that she felt kind of scared and kind of it was very dark. And eventually throughout her hour-long process, she started to break into the light and noticed that she was in a cocoon and that she was starting to break free of that. But that's also when the medicine started to wane. And so part of our integration was, what would it be like to go back into that feeling that imagery, the feeling, the whatever was there for her, and just see where it went with finding a brain spot that correlated with her noticing what that felt like in her body. And it was a beautiful process. Not surprisingly, she was eventually able to kind of break out of that feeling and feel more enlivened, more as the butterfly in that sense. And again, this is a metaphor, but it's a feeling and a connection. And she went on to be able to do a lot more things and not be caught in any fear cycles. So again, I love it as an adjunct or a continuation of care, I should say. But I think it's, we're right on the precipice, and I'm actually going to be doing I'm a board member of the Rocky Mountain Brainspotting Intsitute, and we raise money to help people be able to get brain spotting. And so one of the ways that we do that is through informational sessions. So at the end of April, I'll be doing an hour-long talk on this subject, on psychedelics and brain spotting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm curious, kind of anecdotally, what your experience has been on incorporating those modalities with your clients. Do you generally use it when you feel like you are not getting the results that you would expect, or that you or the client desire initially, or is that it's something that after initial assessment you may reach for right out of the gate? Like, what's kind of your pathway in thinking about utilizing this?
Sure. Are we talking about the psychedelics or the brain spotting?
Psychedelics, correct.
You got
as
it.
an
Okay, great. So where we are, I'm in Boulder, Colorado. So we just had the amendment that passed, and that will afford us a lot more once our board gets up and running and works with the Department of Regulatory Agencies. So that'll take some time to be able to have healing centers. So as we are today set up, it's ketamine, but it soon will be psilocybin, and then others, plant medicines will be coming. So I currently don't help administer any of the psychedelics, but I have plenty of clients, just as you were speaking to. If they hit a place, I notice with major depression, ketamine often does a very good job. And then some long-term grief, because I still have about a quarter of the folks that I work with, because of my background in hospice, can often be something where I might recommend, and then I work in connection. I've actually gone into a facility to be the person to sit with those folks, and I've also just been on either side to be able to kind of walk them through preparation questions they might have, and then to do the integration work. So again, in my so far, major depression and then prolonged grief process tends to be a really good one for that.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, Thad, if folks wanted to learn more about brain spotting or find a practitioner in their area, what are some of the best resources for them to reach out to begin to connect with practitioners who provide this service?
Great. If we're looking for general brain spotting, brainspotting.com. That's hosted by Dr. David Grant, who again developed brain spotting. Is a great place to go. And then you can figure out folks where you live. I'm also a resource, especially looking for people more in that performance area. I'd be happy if people reached out to me. I can help them get hooked up. And then there's the Rocky Mountain Brainspotting Intsitute, which again, I'm a part of that. We also have a directory, as does some of the other brain spotting institutes in the United States. So just putting in brain spotting and the city you're living in, often we'll have stuff popping up, but brainspotting.com and Rocky Mountain Brainspotting Intsitute will definitely have that information.
That's great. And do you ever have folks come from out of town to work with you for sessions? That would be an option for some folks.
Yes, I've had that. And if I'm very clear about it, but if I'm working as a coach, and so we're working on something directly related to performance issues, and I'm not their psychotherapist because I'm not licensed in other states, I can also I do plenty of my brain spotting online. So I definitely work with people in other states as well.
Oh, that's great. So even from the get-go, this is a modality that lends itself to the telehealth format?
It does beautifully. It's one of those that pre-pandemic, I didn't have a lot of background with it, and I'll be honest, I was definitely anxious on top of everything that was going on when the pandemic started. But now I'd say 3/4 of our trainings are online, and so it works very well. And again, it allows, especially with anybody, but with athletes, it allows them to be able to jump on, be able to be, fit in an hour and not have to drive out to me or to wait until they can be in town. So it really opens up that possibility a lot better.
Well, this has been really informative and exciting. I know that, for all of us, in the performance or the athletic space, especially if it's our profession, it's not really a question of if, but when we're going to have, issues with, us being able to tap into the flow state. So I think, having this as a resource when we do feel like we're hitting roadblocks of that nature is super beneficial. So I really appreciate you bringing it to our community as a potential resource for them.
Well, again, I really appreciate being on with you and being able to talk about it. So thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Hey, everybody, a quick note about our precision medicine training program. It's been a really popular course. We're constantly hiring health coaches and physicians, but we're only hiring them as we grow if they're trained in precision medicine. You don't get that in medical school or other places. And so we've developed this training program, and we've completely revamped it recently. It's a lot more robust. So now there's still over 50 hours of live synchronous training. There's also all the asynchronous credit, over 50 hours of content. And as a physician, you get about 50 hours of AMA Category 1 CME credit, which is a nice benefit. For the health coaches going through the training program, it's now accredited by the National Board of Health and Wellness Coaching. So graduates are going to meet the requirement to sit for the board exam and become board certified health coaches. So there's a lot of benefits to that, not just the certification, but also when it comes to things like insurance reimbursement. So it's a really robust program. If you're a physician, a nurse practitioner, a PA, or someone that just wants to be a health coach, it's open to all of those categories. There's the 6-month program that's kind of the full program. And then we also have just a fundamentals of precision medicine course, which is completely on your own. It's online. It's all asynchronous. You still get the 50 hours of AMA Category 1, but it's self-paced, and you still have access to the online community, but not all the synchronous lectures as well. So if you're interested in checking that out, go to wildhealth.com/education, and we'd love to have you as part of our next class.